Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to another world-class event brought to you by Technion UK, supporting, promoting Technion in Israel, who are undoubtedly doing phenomenal work in innovation, science, biotech, and specifically in trying to resolve this problem of COVID-19. We are so glad to have you here with us tonight for what will be a spectacular event with a fantastic guest. But without your support, we can't host these. Without your support, we can't promote and help and support the science that's taking place in the Technion in Israel. So continue to log in, continue to follow us, continue to support, because together we can make a huge difference. And that's what we do at Technion UK. My name is Paul Charney. I'm chairman of Technion UK, and I'm delighted and honored to host tonight what is one of the most renowned guests I think we've had at the Technion UK. I'd like to talk a little bit about, if you don't mind, Sir Richard Dearlove. So a little bit of background about Sir Richard. Was born 1945 and was head of the British Secret Service, the MI6, from 1999 until 2004. Currently, Sir Richard serves as chair of the Board of Trustees at the University of London, and previously served as Master of Pembroke College at the University of Cambridge from 2004 to 2015. Sir Richard was born in Cornwall and is the son of Jack, who was an Olympic silver medalist in rowing. Sir Richard graduated from Queen's College in Cambridge with a master's degree in history. Sir Richard joined MI6 in 1966 and was posted various places around the world. Sir Richard has always been a good friend of Israel and worked closely on intelligence services to help certainly cross and share information which will help keep us all certainly safe and has kept us safe for so many years. So without further conversation or waiting for this wonderful man, Sir Richard, it is a pleasure to have you with us tonight, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for your introduction, very generous introduction, and I'm really sorry that this isn't taking place in person. We've all done lots of Zoom and Microsoft conferences, and I must say I find lacking the human dimension is a real loss. I can't see people's faces whilst I'm talking, and that's a big disadvantage. I have to admit at the beginning a link with Stanmore as well, because my aunt and uncle lived in Stanmore for many years. He was the managing director of Phoenix, and every Boxing Day we had a big family reunion in their house there, which is now demolished, and I think has been a subject of a property development. Anyway, that's by the way. I'm going to talk really about geopolitics, about the international situation. And it's very hard to be predictive, but what I really would like to identify is what I think are the main trends and developments which may help us understand some of the extraordinary events that are happening around us now. I'm really conscious that I'm speaking to you a week before a rather crucial presidential election in the United States. And I think it would be dangerous for me to make predictions. All I'll say is I think Trump will do rather better than the polls indicate. That is the character of his politics. And I think it will be a close run election, and the voting in the Electoral College will be close. What I really wanted to say about that election, because it is a rather extraordinary confrontation politically between Biden and Trump, is I don't see that really so much as, let's say, a driver of change. I think it's more symptomatic of the age that we're living in and the conditions that we are living in. And I might come back to make a few observations later in my talk. The other thing I'm very conscious of here in the UK, and you could argue it's a bit more parochial, but not for us in the UK. You know, we're on the threshold of leaving the European Union, which for us here, of course, is an event of great significance. And I'll talk a little bit about that. I mean, I'd like to start off by making some general geopolitical observations, and then I'm going to talk specifically, I think, about China. I'm sure you'll be interested if I talk a bit about the Middle East, because a lot of my professional experience was, well, when I was head of service, I spent a lot of time dealing with Middle Eastern problems and traveling in the Middle East and meeting Middle Eastern leaders. And I might just actually pay a very heartfelt tribute here to my good friend, Ephraim Halevi, who I'm still in touch with, who of course was head of Mossad during the period that I was the chief of SIS. And Ephraim and I had a wonderful professional relationship, and I esteem his friendship and value very much the contact with him. We didn't always agree, but we always had a very constructive exchange, and I think we benefited a lot from working with each other during various points of crisis and difficulty. Really, the point that I want to focus on is that we're in a very dynamic and extraordinarily dynamic period in international relations. And I think one can characterize it very simply by just describing it as the disappearance of the post-war international security system, the end of what we've all, I think, referred to as Pax Americana. And I think that we've had three defining events over the last 15, 20 years. Of course, there's 9/11, which is one of those lines in contemporary history when you have a before and you have an after. There was the financial crisis of 2008, the almost collapse of the global banking system. And then, of course, now we're confronted with this extraordinary pandemic. And I think, you know, it's been observed by many historians that things that start off as small events, an outbreak of illness in Wuhan, can then lead to events that have a global impact. And there's no question that the pandemic is an accelerator, it's a catalyst for change. It's pushing countries in all sorts of directions to make decisions which in normal times would not have been made, at least not in such a short time frame. And I think the other point that I want to make is underlying these sort of concatenation of extraordinary events, we're witnessing a huge technological upheaval. I'm not going to talk a great deal about it. You've seen what expertise there is in Technion, which is a marvelous university and a marvelous sort of research institute. But I think one of the things that I find quite remarkable about the technology that forms such an important part of all our lives now is it cuts in two directions. In authoritarian cultures, it's been used to increase the power of the state. And of course, the leading example of this is in China, where AI and sophisticated information technology is really being used to document and control the lives of individual citizens in this vast country with a vast population. And you can see the way that the Chinese have manipulated their technological ability to increase their control of the population. The effect in the West has been exactly in the opposite direction. I would argue that our attitude to technology has diffused power away from governments. We have allowed technology to empower the individual. We all carry in our pockets massively powerful computers, which give us options which certainly at the start of my professional lifetime back in the mid-60s was completely unthinkable. And one of the drivers in the West, which is a consequence, I think, of technological change and particularly social media, is the rise of identity politics. And I mean, I'm not going to, as it were, express too many strong opinions today. But I mean, if you take something like Black Lives Matter, a movement like that could never, ever have taken off without the social media driver. I mean, do any of you, well, I'm sure all of you do, but I often ask people the question, well, what's the percentage in the British population of Black, African, Caribbean, that ethnic group? And most people say it's much higher than it's actually 3.3%. And I think it's worth bearing that in mind and then judging that against the social impact in recent weeks of Black Lives Matter. It's very surprising. And that, I think, is a consequence of this diffusion of power across individuals and individual groups. It makes them very adept at broadcasting and expressing their ideas if they make clever use of these extraordinary, powerful facilities. Now, to get back to my sort of main theme, which is the change in the international system. I mean, it really is in the process of being upended. And I think that the key future relationship around which a new international system will have to be built is almost certainly the relationship between the United States and China. They are the two powers. And you have China emerging now onto the world stage, having established itself as a regional power. And we can see its pretensions to become a global power and to have global power status. And I think it's quite striking the way that China, in our geopolitical concerns, has simply displaced Russia. Russia is still consequential. I'm not going to talk about Russia very much. And you might say, well, why? Well, certainly Russia is a country which has significant impact in Europe and in the Middle East, and I would see it as a sort of destabilizer and a troublemaker. But bear in mind, and people are surprised when I say this, that Russia, in fact, now has more or less the GDP of Italy, somewhere around 13th or 14th in the world. And it has an aging population. It has a very weak industrial base. It's commodity dependent. It's got dreadful demographics. And it's a declining power, unquestionably. And it will play an important role in Europe in particular, and to an extent in the Middle East, where it's chosen to intervene more aggressively. But it is not going to be calling the shots when one looks at the really big strategic issues of the international scene. And I think one of the achievements of the Trump administration, and I do see quite a lot of positive aspects in Trump's foreign policy, has been to wake us up to the realities of the West's relationship with China. And I think this is something which will not change if Biden is elected. We've moved now into a different phase. And I think here in the UK in particular, the Cameron government was overindulgent towards China. I was extremely critical of the extent to which they were prepared to embrace China without paying due critical attention to the problems that China also posed. And there's no question that China has been studying us very, very closely. China understands us extremely well. Look at the number of Chinese students going through our universities, and I think this applies in Israel too. Yet we on our side, as a nation, are pretty ignorant about the Chinese. And just let me give you one example, which is the extent to which, and this is certainly a problem here in the UK, the Chinese have positioned themselves in crucial areas of science in all of our leading universities. And although some of this is, as it were, for the good of humanity and easily explained, some of it is definitely driven by Chinese intelligence and an organized attack on our intellectual property and the ability of the Chinese to methodically sweep up and benefit from research which has been conducted at a very high level in science. And I mean, this is a growing problem. And if you want me to illustrate how the Chinese manipulated this, I think one has to look no further than Huawei. And I have been, or had been, a rather lone voice in calling for Huawei to be excluded from 5G systems. And I'm really thrilled and delighted that we have, persuaded the government, and some of us have been lobbying the government extremely hard on this issue, to cut Huawei out of our future 5G, because I just instinctively know, on the basis of my professional experience, that the Chinese have built themselves that position in international information technology and telecommunications to a point where in the future they could, if they wished, exploit it for quite fundamental strategic purposes, and we would be vulnerable. I mean, the country which woke up to this before we did, before the Americans did, was Australia, given their proximity to China, their membership of the Pacific community. And they took early measures to hold back the Chinese in certain areas. Now, I'm not preaching a Cold War. And let me give you an example of why I'm not. All I'm saying is that we need a much more careful relationship with China. We need to modulate our attitude. We need a less permissive approach. But we have to accept that our economies are intertwined with the Chinese, and that will maybe vary over time, but it will not change greatly. And for example, 2 days ago, the Ant payment system, Jack Ma's company that controls massive payment system across the whole of China, had a flotation, and those of you who follow these things will be aware that it actually beat Aramco in terms of the value of the flotation. $34 billion was raised by the flotation. And if you look at the investors, for example, one of the biggest investors, institutional investors in Ant, is the Canadian government pension system. Now, Canada is part of Five Eyes. They're one of our closest friends and allies. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's to point out the extent to which our economies are integrated. So I do not see, as it were, we have a competition with China, we have a contest with China. There will be grave problems in dealing with them, but it is not going to be like the Cold War. And at some point in the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years, I think the United States and China will sit down to work out how a new security system will, as it were, operate across the world to replace Pax Americana. So Pax Americana will become, for those of you who are Latinists, Pax Americana et Sericana. I'm sure that that will provoke quite a lot of questions. And for the moment, let's leave it there, and let me move on to say a few things about the Middle East. And I think these are equally important observations, particularly for the state of Israel. There has been, as all of you will be aware, a fundamental shift in the Middle East. And the basic fact is that the Palestinian issue is no longer being allowed to define much of the region's politics. And this is a huge change. The truth about the Palestinian issue, in my opinion, is that most Arab leaders, or the leadership of most Arab states, lost patience with the Palestinians quite well over the last 5 to 7 years. I mean, Arafat had the possibility of doing a reasonable deal over Palestine, and when it got to the crunch, he funked it. He just couldn't make that agreement. And I don't want to advertise this too strongly, but I mean, I met Arafat quite a few times during that period. And frankly, he had lost it. I mean, it was alarming that a man who was apparently as unstable mentally as he appeared to be in conversation, and you know, the prize of that agreement within his hands. And since then, there has been a shift in the Arab world. And of course, the incoming Trump administration, I think, understood this and have consequently exploited it. Now, I'm not going to go into all the complexities of what's happened, but the defining issue now across the Middle East is, of course, the Sunni Shia divide and the future of how the Arab world deals with Iran. And the big change was when Trump threw in his cards unequivocally with Saudi Arabia, which the Americans had not done in that decisive sense previously. And when Trump also dumped the nuclear control agreement, the JCPOA with Iran. And I mean, personally, I was strongly opposed to that agreement. I thought it gave far too much license to the Iranians. And I think it was a very courageous and sensible move by the Americans. I disagree with UK policy in this particular area. And of course, what has happened is one has had a series of rather extraordinary events. The Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan have all established diplomatic relations with Israel. And we have a situation where Israel and Saudi Arabia are, in practical terms, allied against Iran. And of course, there is a dimension to this which is not in public view. Of course, the question is, can Saudi Arabia now also establish diplomatic relations with Israel? I think that probably is going to be too difficult for the Saudis to take as a public step because of their role of leaders of Sunni Islam and their protection of the holy places of Islam. But it doesn't detract from the fact that we have this new relationship, which is very important to the future of the Middle East and indicates that the dynamics of the whole situation there are moving forward and changing. The other extraordinary event, of course, was the assassination or the killing of Soleimani, the head of the IRGC, by the Americans, which was a calculated and a courageous move. I mean, this character was the exporter of Iran's revolutionary capability across the countries like, Yemen, Iraq, where the Iranians have been heavily involved in sort of destabilizing and fighting what has been described as distance wars. And there's no question that this has put Iran on the back foot and really made it clear to them that they cannot continue to destabilize the whole of the Middle East with impunity. So we have a situation which is ongoing, which is developing, which I think is important, of course, for the security of the Middle East and will over time change the dynamics. The UK, in my opinion, has been very reluctant and very slow to shift its policy. I think we are maybe preoccupied with the Brexit issue, but I would very much like to see the UK sort of thinking hard and modernizing in a way its own Middle Eastern policy, and that may well happen when we get beyond Brexit. I said I would speak until 20 past, and then there'll be time for questions, because I'm sure lots of you will want to ask me questions. And I thought I'd just make some comments about Brexit. I mean, those of you who know anything about me will know that I have been a firm, actually one of the very few senior national security people who have been a firm Brexiteer. And let me explain. Well, let me say first of all that I'm pretty sure that the EU only ever does deals at the very last minute and literally after the last minute. They have this habit of stopping the negotiating clock. And I think that we will have, my expectation is a free trade deal, but with an extended negotiation on unsettled issues. And if you look at another country in Europe which has had huge problems with the EU, which is Switzerland, Switzerland have been in an almost constant state of negotiation. I wouldn't be at all surprised if the UK sort of slipped sideways, whereby we're not prepared to make any important concessions on issues relating to our sovereignty and what happens, as it were, within our borders and in our, as it were, areas of interest. But I think that there will be enough agreed to secure the free trade deal. Why am I a Brexiteer? Well, perhaps my ideas are a little unconventional, but I personally think the EU is reaching the end of its effective political life. I think it will be sustained as a trading organization, but essentially it was created to originally prevent another war between France and Germany. Let's be quite blunt about this. And the Eurozone, in my opinion, has now become rather like Germany's monetary empire. And if you look at the balance of interest for the UK in our membership, I think there are just too many constraints and restrictions, and it delivers us insufficient advantage politically. And I think the problem with, as it were, the Remain case is it was purely based on trade and GDP and wealth issues. And it failed to, as it were, look more at the emotional issues, and it failed to look at, as it were, our issues of sovereignty, which I think are very important in determining our attitude. I am very supportive of a strong continental alliance, with the UK supporting that alliance. But as with Churchill, I do not believe that we are historically suited to being, as it were, fully integrated into such a unit. And I mean, the EU now is at a crossroads where, if it is to survive, and I don't think it can deal with this problem, it has to integrate politically, particularly integrate through closer fiscal and monetary policy. Had the UK still been a member, we would have fought tooth and nail to prevent this. So in a way, you could argue that the EU will be better off without us. And I think that the one aspect of this which has not been properly debated or properly considered is our security and defense relationship with Europe, and the extent to which continental Europe depends on the UK. And Monsieur Barnier in particular annoys me because he doesn't seem to have any comprehension of this issue at all. The UK is Europe's defense, security, and intelligence leader. We have been very careful over the years not to put any of those equities in the hands of the European Communion. It's an unspoken aspect of British policy that Brussels, for the UK, does not have, as it were, any remit in this particular area. And frankly, if you take a longer view beyond Brexit, it's important for Europe that they retain these links with us. And I'm pretty confident that this is a card which has, as it were, great long-term power and puts us in a position where ultimately we will have a good working relationship with continental Europe, as we have usually done historically. I mean, the UK's national security depends on what happens largely on the European continent. But as I've said, the EU does deals at the last minute. I think there will be uncertainty right up to the end. But it's very important, in my opinion, that we do not compromise our sovereignty over the fishing issue. It's important that we do not allow the European Court of Justice any jurisdiction. It's important that we do not allow the EU internal control of the Northern Ireland's anomalous position in the Irish, on the same island as the Irish Republic. And these are all areas of difficulty, but I think will ultimately be resolved. Just coming back to the US election, and maybe I can finish on this point, from the UK's domestic and European point of view, Trump will be a better president for us, and some of you may be surprised by me saying that, than Biden. Biden is an old-fashioned Irish Catholic, or comes from that background. And he represents a part of the Democratic Party that has particular views in relation to Ireland. And that's been developed into a particular view about Brexit, which will not favour the UK's interest. And that is an aspect, despite our special relationship with whatever administration is in Washington, that's something that worries me. Now, maybe it's exactly 20 past. I'm very good at keeping to time. And I'm open for questions, which I think are going to be moderated for me.
Oh, they are actually. Thank you very much, Sir Richard. As you suspected, we have actually had quite a lot of questions. So I am going to just read out the ones that are most relevant to what you've been speaking about. And then obviously, if we've got time, I'll go on to some other ones. The first one we have is from Arthur. And his question is, right, so historically, a few hundred years ago, China was a major power. They lost power and are now regaining it. Is this re-establishment of old power structures away from the West, especially with the breakup of Western alliances, e.g. Brexit, NATO, etc.?
I mean, China, has refound its historic identity, you could put it like that. And it has emerged through a powerful economy as an important international player. And yes, it's something that we have to contend with, we have to accept. Sorry, can you repeat the second part of the question?
Okay, so it says, is this a re-establishment of old power structures away from the West, especially with the breakup of Western alliances, e.g. Brexit, NATO, etc.?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think first of all, I'd say that NATO isn't really breaking up, in my view. I mean, ironically, NATO has been strengthened by Putin's behavior. And although Trump's attitude towards NATO has been equivocal, I think that he has actually been correct in his criticism of the inability of, for example, Germany to pay full NATO dues. But I mean, NATO actually is in better health than people realize. And the defense of the West is still very much NATO oriented. And I think Trump's criticisms of NATO have generally been less lethal than people thought and advantageous to NATO in getting its act back together. The other point, which I think is important to make, is that the re-emergence of China, and I should have covered this in my talk, I think is characteristic of the re-emergence of nation-state interest. I mean, what we're witnessing, in a way, is almost a return to the 19th century, where powerful nation-states are asserting their interest, and there's a sort of shrinkage in the influence of international organizations, notably the United Nations. And I think that if I were, or had to make a prediction, I think what we're going to see is some sort of congress of nations along the line of the 19th century, where nation states enter alliances or groups, and that will sort of order the international scene. I mean, you could argue that this is a more volatile and dangerous future. I'm not so sure about that, because China will have its area of interest, the United States will have its area of interest. I mean, Europe will still be very much NATO, but the individual nation states, I think, are going to have louder voices and, as it were, call the shots in their behavior to a greater extent than has been the case since World War II.
Okay, thank you. Right, I've got a question here from Michael. He says, I have read that during your career you had a high level of cooperation with Israel, But what I wanted to ask you was whether the political situation prevents many countries to cooperate with Israel intelligence-wise, and does that lead to a serious lack of coordination?
This is a very sensitive area, and I'm not sure how much I can actually say about it. But the answer to your question is yes. Israel can be a difficult partner. And I think in the past, for some countries, have been a very difficult partner. And of course, it depends on their orientation towards the Middle East and Palestinian issues. But I mean, what I described as a change in the politics of the Middle East has sort of loosened up the options. And I think it's probably much easier for more countries now to do sensitive business with Israel. But even for the UK, dealing intelligence liaison with Israel could be awkward in certain areas. And the simple reason for that is Israel's single-minded pursuit of its national interest, which leads nations into, disagreeing sometimes with their policies. So it's not a straightforward area at all. But I think the changes that have taken place, the meltdown in Syria, the changes in Iraq, the changes I described with Saudi Arabia, I think probably intelligence liaison with Israel has become rather more, is less nuanced politically than it used to be.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so question here from Mr. Graham. Assuming Biden wins the election, to what extent do you believe it will be possible to speedily rebuild multinational relationships and collaboration on issues ranging from climate change to relationships with China and Russia?
I think that Biden will have a more consensual style of politics. But as I tried to say at the beginning of my talk, it's going to be difficult in some areas for US foreign policy, I'm not talking so much about domestic policy, to be unstitched, because there have been a number of fundamental changes. And I mean, I can give you the example of Iran, where Iran's relations with the European nations that support the JCPOA, I mean, Iran's current violations of that are going to make it very difficult for the European nations to, as it were, have a benign or consensual attitude towards, as it were, renewing the deal with Iran. However, I think in one crucial area, which you mentioned, which is climate change, there would, of course, be a huge shift by a Biden government, because he'll put them back into the Paris Agreement. And on that basis, it may then be possible to build in certain areas better working agreements. But for example, the relationship with China is going to be difficult whether Democrats are in power or not, because the sort of tolerance towards China in terms of its pretty aggressive foreign policy decisions, for example, its behavior in the South China Sea, its rejection of Australia's wish to have a full inquiry into the origins of the pandemic, its attack on Australia for any sort of criticism of China. This makes it difficult. So I mean, the world has moved on from where we were. Consensual relationships in certain areas like climate change and others not. So the world is not going to be a tidy package. It will work together. But I'll make one point about the banking crisis, which I think is worth keeping in mind. When the world was on the edge of a banking collapse, and it really got very, very close to it indeed. The G20 actually came together and did a deal to save it. And I think this is illustrative of when the chips are really down on something really damaging to the global economy, there does perhaps seem to be a willingness to act together. And obviously the area which would be the test case for this is climate change.
Okay, so we're running out of time. We've got 10 minutes left, so I'm going to try and whiz through, and if we can see if we can whiz through some answers, Sir Richard, that would be great.
Yeah, I'll give you short ones. Sorry, I'm getting a bit wordy.
Very difficult. Okay, so this is from Adam. You've spoken about several major risks to global security. What, in your view, is the one major unappreciated risk to global security?
Well, unappreciated, I mean, now control of the pandemic has to be at the top of that list because it's affecting all of the world's economies and politics. So at the moment, I'm going to say dealing with I mean, the measures we're using to control the pandemic at the moment are public health measures, which are pretty medieval in character. They're the same ones that were used in the Middle Ages to try to control the plague. They're public health measures, which have been known about for centuries, and that's the best game in town. We have to hope that, you know, our medical treatment of COVID gets more successful. And I was jolly impressed by the list of Technion research and sort of contribution to world medicine that is coming out of this extraordinary establishment. But right. That's the one I would mention. Of course, the next one is climate change. I mean, you said unappreciated. I mean, maybe we appreciate the major threats. The question is what we're doing about them.
Okay.
Okay.
Right. Next from Judith. Thank you, Sir Richard, for your wonderful overview and insights tonight. Please, can you say more about cybersecurity and terrorism and what impact you believe it will have on the world?
Well, obviously, I think, just briefly, the terrorist threat hasn't gone away. It's in abeyance at the moment, and it seems that the pandemic has, as it were, added to the restraints on terrorism. But the problem of, well, fundamentalist Islam is still there. ISIS is still there. And I'm sure that that problem is not finished. It depends on effective cooperation across the international security community. And very often these terrorist issues get worse as the groups divide and subdivide and become, as it were, less cohesive in their attacks on our interests, and you get lots of individuals and small groups creating problems. And I still worry about terrorists, you know, getting into areas like biotechnology and other areas. Cyber is a massive, I mean, cybersecurity is a massive issue for all of us because of our vulnerabilities. You know, we built our IT systems very fast without really thinking about the extent to which we were all so dependent on them. And we're now applying security to them. It would have been better had they been built from the beginning with the security as a primary defense and primary interest. That hasn't happened. I'm chairman of a cybersecurity company here in the UK, and the vulnerability of our business systems in particular is pretty shocking. And most companies need to take this very seriously indeed. And most individuals, we need to, as it were, be much more vigilant and alert than we are. Technology is catching up. There are lots of good applications, but you need the right people and you need the right experience and the right training to apply them. This is a game of catch up, and at the moment we're behind the problem, and maybe eventually we'll get ahead of it, but it's difficult. It's very tricky.
Okay, and then I think we've got time for one last question from Michael. What is China's ultimate aim with regard to the West? Is it to ensure economic access or subvert the political equilibrium of the West to replace it with its own central command system?
No, I don't think China wishes to go that far. It certainly wishes to assert itself politically and economically within its area of influence, and to be able, as it were, to call the shots in its national interest. I think it will accept that it will have its competitors, the United States primarily. I don't think there's any illusions about the power and importance, of an alternative system. But the Chinese will advertise the benefits of their own system and try, to convert as many of other players in the world that it can. But I think China is also a realist, and they will understand that they will need to reach accommodation, and they will be our competitors, and they will be fierce competitors. But we will be economically entangled with them as well, and to an extent interdependent economically. And it's a big question. If we are going to be interdependent economically, how do we manage this relationship when their value system is so different from ours? It's the big question for the 21st century, and as yet it remains unanswered. But I don't think we're going to have a sort of the Chinese peril creeping over our countries. They will try and assert themselves, as they've done already with Huawei, and we will push them back and say, no, that's too far. And we'll have to establish the lines and the barriers and the divisions and the controls to modulate this relationship, because their value system is so different from ours. You only got to look at what's happened in Hong Kong and you see the proof of that.
Right. Unfortunately, we have run out of time, despite the fact that we have so many questions and so many people saying, wow, so interesting. Thank you so much, Sir Richard. It's always such a pleasure hearing from someone like yourself with such great experience and knowledge of the world stage. Always fascinating and intriguing and interesting. So on behalf of Technion UK, I'd like to thank you very much for taking time out and speaking to us. It really, really is such a pleasure. And thank you to everyone who took part and listened tonight. Good night, everybody.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'm sorry I couldn't be in Stanmore in person.
Another time, please, God.
Yeah.